Welcome to Apple Core, a podcast about the history of Apple. In each episode, we travel back in time to explore the story behind a different Apple product and consider what it tells us about where the company might be heading next. I'm Graham Bauer, a designer, writer, and longtime Apple user.
I'm Charlie Sorrell. I'm a nerd who likes to disagree with Graham.
And I'm D. Griffin Jones, a blogger and video producer and podcaster, currently at Cult of Mac.
And Griffin, welcome to the show. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for allowing me to invite myself on.
And in fact, you suggested the topic for our session today. You have a particular interest in it. But maybe before we reveal what this episode is about, I have a couple of teaser questions to warm us up and introduce the topic. So I've got an easy one and a hard one. Which do you want first?
Let's go for the hard one.
What does speckled eggs mean?
Ooh, speckled eggs. I think this is a reference to a Doonesbury comic.
Oh, very good.
Oh, wow.
Do go on.
Egg freckles, I think, is another permutation of the same joke.
Yes.
But I forget what the original is.
Explain what this Doonesbury cartoon was.
This Doonesbury cartoon is making fun of a particular software feature. I guess the precursor to annoying Siri and the precursor to annoying autocorrect was annoying handwriting recognition, in reference to Apple's first foray into handwriting tablet type devices, the Apple Newton.
Exactly so. The Apple Newton was a handheld computing platform that the company launched in 1993, long before iPhones, smartphones, or even PalmPilots. It was about the size of a paperback book with a black and white LCD display. The screen didn't have multi-touch, so you had to use a stylus, and it recognized your handwriting. And this was before the internet, so you couldn't use it for checking social media or even sending emails. Its primary purpose was just for taking notes and storing contacts or saving calendar appointments like a filofax. In this episode, we'll take a look at how the Newton came about. Griffin will tell us what it's like to use it. And finally, we'll discuss the surprisingly rich legacy it left behind, which literally saved the company and provided the hardware on which every Apple product is built to this day. But before we get into all of that, just going back to that Doonesbury cartoon. So in the cartoon, a character is trying to use the handwriting recognition on his Newton, but it keeps getting things more and more wrong until eventually in frustration he writes catching on, and the Newton interprets that as egg freckles. Apple clearly saw the funny side to this because they included the cartoon as an Easter egg in Newton OS 2. So, before we get into it, let's circle back to that other trivia question, the easy one. What does PDA stand for? And don't say public display of affection.
I know that one.
Do you want to handle that one?
Can I? Can I handle it? Can I answer?
I don't know. Can you handle it?
Is it Pocket Digital Assistant?
That's close, but no cigar.
Portable digital assistant.
Yeah, is it portable?
It's personal digital assistant.
Personal. Okay, well, fine.
Personal digital assistant was a term which was really coined by the Newton MessagePad. Griffin, you're a bit of a Newton buff. Is that fair to say?
I would say that as well. Like, it's the personal digital assistant of the 90s, I would say, is really like the smartphone before the smartphone. It's like computers finally became powerful and energy efficient enough to make the form factor possible. So people started making it before they even really knew what they were trying to build, because I think ultimately, like, the story that we will reveal here is that the Newton was a pretty impressive computer, but they didn't even know what they didn't have at the time in the mid 90s. And that would be like the obvious thing that everybody uses computers for and this form factor for now is browsing the internet in their pocket. But the Newton couldn't do that. So it was kind of just a crummy computer that was isolated in a weird way, but could do a few things like note taking and all that. But it was just missing the 2 or 3 key features that would have made the smartphone.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and this has come up in the show before. When we think about computers now, the internet and networking is so integral to what we use them for that it's almost hard to imagine computers before that. And so when we were looking at iWork in the last episode, office productivity software was really the purpose of personal computers in the late 80s, early 90s before the internet came along. There wasn't really much else that you could do with them. The internet made us completely rethink what a computer was. So when you think about the Apple Newton, it's actually funny looking at its launch software. I think some people today would think, well, what was its purpose? Because it really could only handle a very limited number of functions. And maybe the only networking feature it had was the ability to send faxes. Okay, just before we get into it, the name Newton, I think it's interesting that it was called the Newton because there's this pattern with Apple naming its products after apples. So what other Apple products are named after apples?
The Macintosh.
That would be the biggest one. There's another Apple product that's named after an Apple variety, the very arcane Apple product, a games console.
Oh, the Pippin.
Yes. And then I was thinking about the Newton. I thought, well, maybe Newton is a variety of apple. And I don't think that it is. I think it's just named after fig rolls, probably more likely Isaac Newton. And there is obviously another connection between Isaac Newton and Apple, which is...
The original Apple logo
Yes.
was a woodcut, maybe not woodcut. It's in that style of drawing by one of their first investors, Ronald Wayne, that depicted him sitting under an apple tree.
Right, yeah. It's a very elaborate logo with swirly script, and it looks nothing like the visual identity of Apple that we know today.
No, it looks like something from a 1970s folk band, an album cover.
I'm not even sure that Isaac Newton actually did really ever claim to have sat under an apple tree when he discovered the theory of gravity and his Principia, but it's a good story and it was a bad logo. But I think it was a good name for a tablet product in the 1990s, which is what we're going to talk about today.
Here's a trivia question I'm going to throw back at you. What is the quote in the original Apple logo around the border of the image?
The quote?
Yes. For people who aren't able to see it, the original Apple logo is so incredibly detailed that in tiny little text, almost like when you look really close at like a US dollar bill or something, you see like all those tiny words, the more you stare at it. There's this really tiny quote that goes all around way around the edge. It is Newton, hyphen, 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 a mind forever voyaging through strange seas of thought, hyphen, 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 alone.
Wow.
Well, that's an acid trip of a tagline.
Apple was in a different place back then, I guess, to the company that we know today. Interesting. Okay, so we're talking about the year 1993. This is the year that the Apple TV Plus show Shining Girls is set. Meatloaf was doing anything for love. The fashion at the time was plaid, Doc Martens, and high-waisted mom jeans. The hit TV shows were The X-Files, Fran Drescher in The Nanny, and Frasier. So that's what was going on in 1993, the year in which Apple decided to drop the Newton MessagePad on us. And you can make a case to say it was the first PDA. It was certainly the first product to call itself a PDA. The term personal digital assistant is one that Apple coined. But there was another product that was around prior to this, a British product.
That was the Scion Organizer.
Exactly so. Tell us about the Scion Organizer.
It looked like a pocket calculator. It had a tiny LCD screen above a grid of buttons, which were kind of squishy and annoying. The whole thing was very distinctive and super 80s and quite cool.
It was quite cool, but I think it only had like 2 rows of text. So getting across things like a calendar would be kind of hard to do on 2 rows of text. But that is the technological landscape that existed when the Apple Newton came along. The first thought that I had in terms of a personal digital assistant, it wasn't something for navigating the internet. So what was it for? I think what it was doing was it was replacing the Filofax. Do you guys remember Filofaxes?
I had a Filofax and I loved it. I was totally into it. I spent all my time putting in dividers. So if anyone doesn't know, it's like a little folder with a ring binder, more or less A5 size, but not quite A5. It was a proprietary size. And you could get all kinds of inserts that will go in it. So there'll be a diary, notes, but then other stuff like little plastic wallets or a ruler and all kinds of things.
When I think about the Filofax now, it conjures up images of Gordon Gekko and Patrick Bateman, right? You're like a Wall Street executive, you're wearing your suspenders and you've got your Filofax and you're just...
Yeah, it was total yuppie wear. But then so was the first cell phone when it first came out. I mean, that was also total yuppie wear.
It sounds to me like this is like the white collar equivalent of like a fully geared up like military like SWAT team type person, except it's the white collar. It's like the office version of that. So, you've got your suspenders, you got pockets for your pens and your business cards and your pocket calculator and basically everything that you could possibly need or encounter in a business setting.
Tactical office drone.
Also, to set up a bit of the scene at Apple is that the Macintosh had been out for 9 years at this point, and they were already internally experimenting with like what comes after the Macintosh, which might sound a little ludicrous, but in the 80s, it wouldn't be uncommon for a completely brand new computer platform to get 2 or 3 revisions and then be entirely replaced. So by the late 80s, they experimented with this concept called the Apple Jonathan.
Oh, yeah.
They eventually decided to go all in on the Macintosh, and they expanded it with the Macintosh 2 because formerly it was just this all-in-one machine. By 1993, they had already tried and failed with the Macintosh Portable, which is a whole Apple Core episode all on its own. They're approaching the 10th year of the Macintosh, and so they're wondering if they should do anything special there. John Sculley, the CEO of Apple, immediately after Steve Jobs' outing, is trying to find what will be his mark on the company. And the Newton was really what he hedged his legacy on. This was very much John Sculley's project and product that he wanted to get out the door. This was his Macintosh in a way.
So this is interesting. You touched on where Apple's Mac business was, Griffin, and you also touched on John Sculley and his legacy and his thinking. And I just thought it'd be interesting to unpack both of those a little more, because firstly, where the Mac business was at, I think at this point, 1993, it's firing on all cylinders. From a slightly shaky start when the Mac came out, it was a little underspec'd, a little overpriced. It didn't quite hit the market in the way in which it needed to. After various revisions, sales of the Mac were great, and they'd really found the purpose of the Mac. It was surfing the wave of the desktop publishing revolution. But Microsoft was coming. It was coming for the Mac business. And I think Apple knew that. And against that context, they're struggling to keep up with the innovation coming from Redmond. They took the opportunity to come up with a whole new OS, with the Newton OS, which was an interesting choice. The other thing, in terms of John Sculley and his legacy and his thinking, John Sculley was a marketing genius. He was credited with inventing the Pepsi Challenge. Do you remember that?
I do remember the Pepsi Challenge. We used to hang out in the leisure centre where there was a gaming arcade and roller skating. And somebody came and asked me if I wanted to do the Pepsi Challenge. This was in the 80s, I guess. And you had to blind taste 2 different Cokes and tell them which one you thought was Pepsi or which one you liked. But the thing is, kids all drink loads of Coke, so it's really easy to tell which is which. So I just told them that I liked the one that wasn't Pepsi, and they didn't look very happy. So I guess right. I was annoying even then.
Yeah, some things don't change. Do you remember, it's a classic story, in 1983, when John Sculley was hired as the chief exec of Apple, the pitch that Steve Jobs used to get him to join the company?
Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to change the world?
That was his pitch. And I think something about it really stuck with John Sculley. So he's a marketing genius, right? But was he a technological genius? And that was something that he wanted to prove. And one of the ways he went about that was a video Apple produced in 1987 called Knowledge Navigator. Any of you remember that? The Knowledge Navigator?
It was a concept video that begins with this stuffy academic professor type strolling into his fine oak wood decorated office. And then he opens up this computery book thing sitting on his desk. And then it opens up with like a cartoon drawing of like the Mac OS 8 desktop with a spiffy little man with a bow tie smiling back at him who says, "Good morning. How can I help you?" And then it's like a 10 minutes as he asks this tablet thing sitting on his desk to like pull in data from various vague, not really explained sources. He does like a video call with one of his colleagues. And then he basically uses voice commands to put this presentation for a lecture together.
And this video Apple made as a vision of where it saw technology going. And they don't so much do this anymore. It's so rare that Apple expresses its vision of where things are going. They say, we don't comment on unannounced products. They don't like to show their hand at all. But this was a different company under John Sculley. And yeah, back in 87, this video was very much tipping Apple's hand to where John Sculley saw the future. And I don't know what you guys think, but he wasn't so wrong, was he? He had the internet, he had a touch-based tablet, he had video conferencing, he had removable media. What did you think of that video?
It's always interesting, like what people in the past think the future is going to be like, because they get so many things right. But then there's always like the one fundamental thing that they get wrong. And that is, Apple is with their Apple Intelligence features is trying to do what people in the past imagined computers of the future doing. And that is like, you can just give it a voice command and the voice assistant will be able to plug into apps and basically do all of the work for you. That's the one thing that voice assistants haven't been able to do yet.
It's interesting how the things that seem easy to do with a computer and the things that seem hard are not really the things that are easy and hard to do with a computer. So we still haven't cracked controlling a computer with a voice. Even with the AI and LLMs and stuff we're using now for it, it's still not very good. We learn how to speak to them. It's not the other way around. When you tell it a reminder, it actually sets a reminder instead of trying to play a song called The Reminder by Feist or something. And if you've ever programmed anything, then you know how hard those problems are to solve, because that's just not how computers work. Maybe the fact that Sculley was in charge of this project shows that he was not really much of a technology guy and didn't really know how computers worked.
I mean, that said, I don't think Steve Jobs was ever a developer. He was someone that had a vision for how technology should be used. And one way or another, he had the power of motivating people to build the stuff that he wanted. I love that Griffin picked up on the bow tie. You mentioned that a couple of times. And the bow tie really stuck with me too. I don't know if he had a British accent, But to me, he was like a butler and he could have had a British accent. And I feel like that's the missing ingredient for Siri now. They've made a big step forward this year, but I won't feel Siri is complete until it has a bow tie. And then I will know that it's some subservient butler that's going to, just sort all my shit out for me. So the Apple Newton was not the Knowledge Navigator, but I remember a lot of the talk at the time connected the two, because 87, this video of the Knowledge Navigator came out. And then a few years later in 93, we get the MessagePad 100, the first Apple Newton device. And it wasn't delivering everything that was promised in the Knowledge Navigator video, but it was very much seen as the first step on that journey. It was a different form factor. It didn't have a touch sensitive screen, but it did have a stylus. So you were more interacting directly with this Newton device than you did with a Mac. And so from that vision video that showed the path that Apple was on, the Apple Newton was effectively the first step on this road towards the Knowledge Navigator. So Michael Chow is a long-time Apple executive. In fact, he's had 2 spells at the company. But here, when we go back to the early 90s, he was the product line manager of the Macintosh hardware and software group at the time. And apparently he came up with the idea for the Newton on a plane journey, and he pitched it to John Scully, and Scully liked the idea, and that is how the Newton came to be. Interestingly, Michael Chow is now responsible for the iPad, and he's been working on the iPad for quite a while.
Another interesting connection we can draw there is that as Apple is developing the Newton, they actually have 2 different products in mind. They had the notebook-sized version that we're all familiar with and ended up being one of only 2 form factors that they ended up shipping. But an early prototype of the Newton was actually much larger. It would have been about the size of 2 of them combined, with a screen as big as like a full like letter-sized sheet of paper. And like the black borders around the edge would have grown even more to be really the sort of product that you would set up on a desk or like an airplane fold-out tray table, rather than something that's slightly too big to fit in a pocket.
Interesting. Yeah. And that pocket thing, apparently, when they were developing the MessagePad, one of John Scully's requirements was that it should fit in his pocket.
Well, I would say John Scully must have very large pockets.
Well, yeah. One of the jokes that the design team were making was that they were going to break into John Scully's office and retailor his suits to make the pockets bigger. These devices were enormous. But I remember back at the time in the 90s, I was in awe of how compact they were. So you kind of have to put these in the context of the time. These were really svelte devices, but by today's standards, they're like gigantic bricks.
The screen is like roughly the size of an entire modern iPhone Pro Max sized iPhone. I mean, it's a slightly different aspect ratio, so it's a little wider than it's not as skinny as an iPhone, but like the screens are roughly the same size. But then the problem with the Newton is that you then have like these giant inch thick like plastic bezels on the top and bottom, and it's also like an inch thick rather than iPhone thinness. You might be able to put it in like a jacket pocket, but no way it's getting in like a pants pocket.
The design of these devices was very different to, it was called Snow White, that design aesthetic that the Apple Mac had at the time. So all the Macintoshes had these beautiful creamy white enclosures. And in contrast, this device was, I want to say jet black, but it wasn't really. I mean, most of them had a sort of dark grey look. And that's because they were made with this grippy, rubberized enclosure, which I thought was actually really nice. This sort of rubbery surface that made them very grippy so they didn't slip out of your hands. And this was called the Batman aesthetic. It looks like a Batman suit that this MessagePad is wearing.
I have a question about this coating for Griffin. Mm-hmm. You've got some of these. So
yes.
Do they go sticky and nasty?
They do not. It's there because there is a very common type of plastic coating that was very common in the 90s that did go sticky over time. The Newton isn't quite that. It's a very soft touch plastic, but it's not like that horrible rubber that would, you know, bake in the sun and then peel up into a bunch of gluey, gross layers. Apple's personal products of the 90s were all like this darker sort of plastic. The Macintosh would eventually adopt some of its design elements. Throughout the 90s, they started to move to a less documented, but I think more interesting design aesthetic called espresso that had a lot of like organic, flowing, curvy lines. Like the peak of this was the 20th anniversary Macintosh. But really, if you look at early PowerPC era Macintoshes, had like these sort of like swooping organic shapes to them. Even the stylus isn't like a normal stylus. It gets really thick in the middle and then it gets all thin and then it gets really thick at the end. Like it's very bulbous.
Another Mac that would reflect that design aesthetic would be the PowerBook G3.
Yeah, I was thinking the same.
It's clamshell, and I think that even had some rubberized bits to it. I know that the original iBook, the one that we've been referring to as Barbie's toilet seat, that actually was a combination of polycarbonate and grippy bits. The colored bits were actually some rubber injections. So they had that kind of grippy surface too. So the next interesting thing that happened in 1993 was in the same year that John Sculley is finally starting to deliver on his vision of the Newton, he gets booted from the company. This is very much to do with the struggles with the next generation operating system and the feeling that Apple was treading water and not ready to address the threat from Microsoft. So Sculley didn't get to see through his vision to its fulfillment, whatever that might be. We never got to the bow tie, and maybe we now and we never will.
The interesting thing is that while the Newton was a stepping stone, they did incorporate, as you said, a bunch of little parts of the Knowledge Navigator. And one part that did make it through to the Newton was a very proto-Siri type interface called Assist. The idea being that in the Newton, wherever you are, you can select text and you can tap this Assist button and it'll bring up a little dialog box that you don't really enter in queries in natural language. It's still very much like the text adventure sort of thing where you select a verb and then you say what you want to do with that. So it brings up a pop-up box and you have options where you can say, please do this, or call, fill in the blank, fax, find, mail, and then you just write in what you want, and then there's a button that says do, and then you tap the do button and it'll try to interpret it and do what you think.
Mm-hmm.
So it's even before Siri, and the Siri that we got in 2011 wasn't actually that much more advanced than this. Like Siri still always looks for like the verb that's like text this person, remind me about this, play this song, and it gets it wrong. But the Newton adopted a small amount of that Knowledge Navigator voice control thing in the way that it knew how, which is still through pen input, not voice, but that's what it was capable of.
That's interesting because I think what to me that illustrates and is maybe a common theme, especially in the first version of Newton, is that in almost every respect, it was ahead of its time. And with bleeding edge technology comes subpar user experience. So they were trying to do so many ambitious things with the Newton, and a lot of those things, I guess, weren't landing. And handwriting recognition is one of those things.
Do you know where the handwriting recognition technology came from?
No.
Steve Jobs was on a business trip to Moscow, and we have a Today in Apple History article on this on Cult of Mac, but legend has it that one of the engineers he brought along with him got a knock on his door late at night. He opens the door and he sees a very nervous looking Russian man shove a floppy disk into his hand and then shut the door and run away. When they get back to Cupertino, the guy puts the floppy disk drive into his Mac, probably foolishly. Hopefully he had this Mac isolated somehow.
Air gapped, yeah.
He looked into what was on it and he found handwriting recognition, very early prototypical handwriting recognition software. He doesn't know why he was given it, but that actually became the basis for the handwriting recognition on the Newton.
That's amazing.
That's a crazy story. I thought it was going to be like a hooker at the door, compromat style, but no.
Handwriting recognition in the first version of the Newton operating system was notoriously bad. At this time in the early 90s, I was an art student. I was studying at St. Martin's College of Art in London, and I had to do the washing up in the evenings at Pizza Express to make ends meet. So I couldn't afford my own Mac, and I certainly couldn't afford the MessagePad. But I remember one of my roommate's friends who was crazy rich came over and had one of these things. And I remember distinctly because I was obsessed with Apple. And so seeing this precious thing that this guy had brought into a house, I was just in awe of it. But I remember more than anything, what I wanted was to see how well the handwriting worked, because the media was having a field day about this. It was kind of like the antenna gate of its day, handwriting gate. It was a running joke that this insanely expensive device that, let's be honest, all it really did was replicate the functionality that you could get with a piece of paper and a filofax. And it couldn't even recognize your handwriting. Griffin, you touched at the start of the show, you mentioned the Doonesbury cartoon. And I think that was the point of the cartoon, that the cartoonist was saying these gadget heads, spending an absolute fortune on a device which does nothing more than a pen and paper and does it less well. And that was the framing narrative of the Newton. It got better. Apple worked very hard at this, and the Newton OS 2 addressed a lot of the issues with the handwriting recognition. I would say possibly not to an extent that made it a genuinely useful device. I'm curious, actually, what do you think about that, Griffin? You're using Newtons to this day. Is the handwriting recognition up to snuff? How does it compare with these latest iPad OS betas?
Well, I should say that the Newton that I bought is a MessagePad 2000, so I've only experienced Newton OS 2. I haven't personally used the MessagePad 100 or 110 or any of those early ones. But the important thing is they did get better. They got much better. I mean, still not perfect, but I'd say it got about 90% there. Close enough to where it's like, minimum viable handwriting recognition.
You probably know Andy Anapko, a longtime Apple journalist. He likes to tell a story about when the Newton was first being developed, and they asked him to provide a handwriting sample to use to help train their text recognition. So the upshot of that was that whenever he used it, it really, really did a good job of recognizing his handwriting. So he never encountered any of the problems that anybody else was talking about.
Because they trained the handwriting model on his own handwriting.
Exactly.
That's a way to do it. So how did I actually use my Apple Newton? Well, although I may look like I only recently graduated high school, I actually attended college before the iPad Pro and the original Apple Pencil shipped. The Apple Newton was Apple's most recent handwriting capable device when I was in college. So I actually used my Apple Newton in college.
Wow.
So I took my Newton to lectures, and I originally tried using it for taking notes in the middle of class, which proved to be a little too much for it to handle because the handwriting recognition is pretty good, but it's not very fast. And there are like just enough errors that it makes to where like, oh, you go back to correct it, but then you've missed the next thing that the professor has said. I did end up incorporating it later, though, when I was studying for a midterm or for a final. I developed a workflow where I would rewrite all of my handwritten notes on the Apple Newton. And the thing about that is that the handwriting recognition on the Newton is so uncannily good, but just slightly frustrating enough that you want to like abbreviate and shorten your notes. And that process of like trying to shorten them and make it less painful on your hands gets you thinking about the content of the notes. And, you know, it really helps you absorb it because you want to make it shorter and you want to like go over and make sure that you're writing things that won't lead to a lot of spelling mistakes that you'll have to fix. And so I would do that for studying. Over the course of like a few hours, I would basically have like recaptured all my notes in my head. That's how I would study.
So you were using the Newton as a revision aid, and as you were entering it into the Newton, you were somehow like entering it into your brain as well.
Mm-hmm. It's not like you're just like blindly rewriting it word for word, because if the handwriting was good enough to make that possible, then you wouldn't really be studying because you wouldn't be thinking about it. You would just be like, you know, input and output without doing any processing on it. But like the Newton is like so slightly frustrating with its handwriting recognition that it made me want to abbreviate, and it made me think about what I was actually doing more.
Interesting. Any other apps that you used on the Newton? I'm thinking, so I guess you're using the Notes app there. Did you use the names and dates apps?
I didn't end up using the names and dates apps. You know, I would use them for fun. Like if I was bored, then I would just enter in some contacts into the dates app. The Notes app is really like the primary app on the Newton. Like when you turn on your iPad or your iPhone, it brings you to the home screen, and the Newton does have a screen that's sort of like that. But interestingly, when you turn on the Newton, it brings you straight to the Notes app, because I think they know that this is by default a note-taking device, not an apps device. It had a very skeuomorphic, not design, but interface, in that if you want to erase text, you actually just scribble it out. And then it disappears with like a poof, which is like the same sort of poof animation that Apple like still uses to this day in a few different areas. If you throw away a note, then you see an animation where it crumbles up and then it flies into the bottom of the screen where a trash can just appears for it to dunk perfectly.
That's right.
Like you just made like a nothing but net in a with your out of your office waste paper basket. It never misses the trash can. It always lands straight down the middle. You know, if you want to select text, they have like a touch input version of what you do with your iPhone, where like, you know, if you want to select text on an iPhone, you tap with your finger and you drag across. Well, you touch your stylus to the screen and then you hear like a little sound effect. And that's how you know you've entered select mode. And then you can just drag your stylus down and it'll select text like that. They really get a lot of the interactions very natural and very right, in a way that I'm actually surprised whenever I use an iPad with an Apple Pencil, that like I expect it to work like a Newton because that's what I used first. And I'm always surprised at like the little basics of the interaction that they don't do. Like tap and hold and drag to select. That's how I think pen inputs should work. I don't even know if that's how the iPad does it, but it's how it should. Another part of the same app is that it's actually a very capable vector drawing program as well. Like handwriting is only one of the modes of input into the Newton. Like you use the same app for drawing, and it's really kind of impressive how it has like almost like the most minimal user interface. You know, it's not like Adobe Illustrator, like layers and objects and all that, but they really spent a lot of work on making it smooth out lines that you draw. You can have advanced like polygon shapes, and then you can select it, and you can select individual nodes of a shape after you've drawn it. You can freely resize these objects if you select them a different way. Like it's really very capable. And that's another thing that I use my Newton for drawing.
So if you draw circles and rectangles and triangles and so on, it recognizes those and tidies them all up. If you do a drawing like that in the Newton, are there ways now that you can export it and use it elsewhere?
There is a program you can use to export your notes onto a Macintosh running Mac OS 8. I've never gotten that to work.
Did you ever send a fax?
I did not ever send a fax.
Who would he send it to?
Exactly.
Well, I'm thinking actually you might be able to use the fax sending to actually export a document.
Ah.
It's a good idea. I mean, there are these modern services that'll like turn your faxes into emails that can just go into your email inbox. I've never tried that, but maybe I will. There is another way to send devices between Newtons if you live in an office full of Newtons. And that is because it was the 90s, they had like these IR blasters in them. So if you positioned them perfectly like across the table from each other, you could send a message from one Newton to another Newton.
Like Furbies.
There are a number of accessories, like they have a plug-in keyboard if you want to type on your Newton. And I have it here. It's kind of like a netbook-sized keyboard. Now Apple refuses to make a keyboard that's any smaller than full-size keys, but this is literally like a laptop keyboard that they just like shrunk 20% to make it fit so that it would match the dimensions of the Newton. I actually found another use case for the Newton that's really great, in that when I was playing Dungeons and Dragons...
I like where this is going.
Yeah, this is already good.
You know, you do your sheet on paper and then you're like constantly erasing and rewriting things. And then I realized this is exactly what makes the Apple Newton great. So I carefully recreated my character sheet on my Apple Newton. One part of the note-taking app that the Newton does really well, that's like fundamental, that's another thing I'm frustrated iPads don't do, is that you can rewrite a word simply by writing on top of it, and then it'll like replace the characters, which is perfect for Dungeons and Dragons because your character stats are changing constantly. You're getting hit, you're getting attacked, you're leveling up. I would just write the new number over the old number, and then it would just replace it in place.
Oh, that's great.
So it's actually very useful for that. And then I can, with a stylus, I can page down to my character notes, add new details about my character, write in all the custom stuff that the Dungeon Master is throwing at me. I can keep my inventory really easily. And you can organize all of your sheets for a specific character into folders because, of course, it's a computer. It has different folders you can organize your notes into. So you can have different campaigns and different folders for different characters and all that.
Amazing.
It's funny when an old technology has a feature which you just can't find on newer things, and it's just better.
Yeah. I love the idea of you using your Newton for Dungeons and Dragons. That is a level of geekery that I bow down and respect.
Yeah, there's some serious nerd points for that.
And it's also just perfectly sized. It's perfectly sized to be like, just big enough in front of you to have like a full character sheet, but it not take up too much room on the table in front of you because, the kitchen table can get very crowded very quickly.
From my recollection of the journey that the Newton MessagePad was on, the thing that really sticks out was, as we've discussed, it was really expensive. It was also kind of big and clunky, which we've also discussed. And then along came a different kind of PDA, which was cheaper, maybe in some respects not quite as good, but a lot thinner and smaller. And it pretty much did everything that the MessagePad did and drank Apple's milkshake. Do you remember what that was?
This is the Palm, no? The PalmPilot?
It was the PalmPilot. Yeah. So tell us about the PalmPilot.
Well, again, it wasn't a cell phone. Not initially. I never had one of those, but I think the thing that people like most about it is that you could synchronize it with your computer. Did that happen with the Newton as well?
Yeah, you could sync it to your Mac and back. I think that the key difference between the PalmPilot and the Newton technology and software stack is that the Newton tried to go all in on you can just write however you write, handwriting or cursive, and it will just interpret it. You just write down as if it's a piece of digital paper, whereas the PalmPilot, you input letter by letter and you had to use their graffiti alphabet. You couldn't write the letter E how you would normally write a letter E. You had to write like a backwards number 3.
I became obsessed with that. When the Newton was scrapped, I went all in on Palm and I was super fast with graffiti. It's so rare now that I write something by hand that when I do, I sometimes find myself reverting into graffiti.
I would do the same. I had a Sony Ericsson phone that came with a stylus and you would enter text into it in a similar way. And I found that, for instance, the P, where you would start at the bottom of the stalk and go up and then do the loop at the end. And there's some of those gestures that I still use now when I'm just handwriting.
And those few compromises that Apple refused to take allowed them to make a thinner, lighter, less computationally intense, much cheaper device.
Exactly. And I think as Apple partisan as I was and still am, I would have to concede that those compromises they made were probably the correct choices. I mean, it did everything that was useful at the time a Newton did at a fraction of the cost and at something that actually you could slip into your pocket. It actually was a small device. And I think from the time at which the first PalmPilot came out, from that point, really, the writing was on the wall for the Newton. Just months before Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, the CEO of Apple at the time, Gil Amelio, announced that Newton was going to be spun off as a separate company. So this company had 170 employees. It was called Newton Technology. And its first product was maybe the one, Griffin, you've got, the Newton 2100.
I have the MessagePad 2000 that was upgraded after the fact to the specs of the 2100. So mine still has an Apple logo on it. But I believe that last Newton, the 2100, had a Newton logo in the middle bottom. And I don't know if it had a physical Apple logo on it or not.
I think it didn't. And I think if you Google that, it looks a bit clunky. It almost looks like they retrofitted the branding, because there's almost like a hole cut out of it where the Apple logo should be, and they dropped the Newton logo in there instead. I didn't like that. It should have an Apple logo on it. And it bugged me, to be honest, that they did that. And I didn't understand why they had spun off the company. And evidently, Steve Jobs didn't either, because one of his first acts when he became the iCEO and booted out Gil Amelio was to reabsorb Newton Technology back into Apple, which happened in 1998. And then some months later, he killed the project. What do you guys think about Steve Jobs killing the Newton? Was it an act of spite? Was it revenge on his nemesis, John Scully, who booted him out a decade earlier? Or why do you think that he killed the Newton?
I think he really just needed all hands on deck to turn the Mac around.
Exactly.
Maybe there's a different universe where Apple buys Next 6 months earlier, and they might have had the resources to keep both of them alive. But I think that even if Apple did have the resources, Steve Jobs probably would have killed the Newton anyways. But maybe if Apple buys Next a year or like a year and a half or 2 years before they did in reality, in like 1995, then maybe he would have kept the Newton around and evolved it. But honestly, I think you would have to construe a very different set of circumstances for the Newton to exist under Steve Jobs.
I was going to say the same thing. I think he was streamlining. He was getting rid of everything that there was a distraction just to save the company. And the Mac was as it turned out, the Mac did save it. What I was thinking also was that this 1997, that was the last one though, the 2100. And the fact that it was just 10 years before the iPhone. And there's such a huge difference, just a massive, massive difference in the technology, the look, everything. It's like two different eras. And if you compare stuff that was going on in 2007 with the computer world 10 years later, or even now, I mean, the iPhone is still, obviously it's changed a bit, but really it's fundamentally the same as it was when it launched. Whereas the difference in the 10 years between the Newton and the iPhone, it seems like a massive jump.
Yeah, that's true. I've sent you, Charlie, a quote from Steve Jobs that's taken from his biography. I thought you might want to read that out.
If Apple had been in a less precarious situation, I would have drilled down myself to figure out how to make it work. I didn't trust the people running it. My gut was that there was some really good technology, but it was fucked up by mismanagement. By shutting it down, I freed up some good engineers who could work on new mobile devices. And eventually we got it right when we moved onto the iPhones and the iPad.
I believe Steve Jobs there. I don't actually think that Steve Jobs would have been spiteful about something like this, because one of the patterns that you see with him over and over again, if someone has a better idea than him, that he genuinely thinks it's a better idea, he changes his mind like the whole time. There's a story Ed Catmull, the co-founder of Pixar, tells in his book Creativity Inc., where Steve Jobs does just that. There was this animator at Pixar, and he wanted Bug's Life to be in 16:9 widescreen ratio, and Steve Jobs was saying it should be in 4:3 because he wanted it to be in the right format for home video. And this animator just felt really strongly that he wanted to do this project in 16:9. Like, Steve Jobs was coming around the office as a kind of senior exec visiting the creatives, and this animator gave Steve Jobs a piece of his mind. And then afterwards, he was thinking, what the hell did I just do? I've just lost my job. I just insulted Steve Jobs. And he spoke to his boss. His boss said, oh no, Steve loved it. He thought, he completely agreed, and he changed his mind. And I think Steve Jobs did that. He tested people the whole time. He wanted to know that they're really passionate about it, that they really believed in it. But if someone gave him a convincing, passionate argument, he changed his mind.
Did he pass it off as his own idea the next day?
Oh, probably, yeah.
I also think that the Newton is a very kind of Jobs kind of computer, because he's always been into making a computer that is easier to use for regular people. And this is a definitely in that direction.
I think so too. I think it was interesting. But as you both said, this was a all hands on deck time to save the company. And as Steve Jobs said in that quote, there wasn't the time and resource to save the Newton as well. And yeah, he did harvest technology from the Newton. And obviously he put out the iPad when the company was all set to do it.
When they eventually ported the handwriting input software to Mac OS X, I think they would call it Inkwell.
That's what I was thinking about, which was a preference pane that would only show up in the system preferences if you had a Wacom tablet or similar.
That was 10.2 Jaguar that they introduced Inkwell. They only took it out in 2019.
Oh, really?
So yeah, the Newton lived on in the Mac for many years. There's one detail here that I find really interesting in the demise of the Newton, which kind of saved the company in the 90s from going bankrupt. And do you know what that was? I'm thinking about another British company here that was involved in the Newton story.
I think I know where you're going with here. The processor used in the Apple Newton
Yes.
was a very experimental processor. There was, I think, like one home personal computer that used it before in the 80s. The Apple Newton used a very experimental processor called the strong ARM processor.
Exactly that. Yeah. And when Apple was looking for a processor for this mobile device, these kind of mobile devices didn't exist at the time. And so they needed a new kind of processor. The ARM processor had a few features that made it ideally suited to mobile computing, its energy footprint, and a lot of the things, which is why all of today's mobile devices are powered by chips that use this same ARM architecture. And even like Macs, of course, today use the ARM architecture as well. And this was really the progenitor of that, this joint venture between Acorn, a company called VSLI, and Apple, that established ARM, a company which, it's incredible to think about this, but when it was founded, Apple owned 43% of ARM. I mean, it's another massive company. Now, if they'd hold on to those shares for a little longer, they would have made an absolute fortune. But they sold a lot of those shares in the late 90s when the company was on the edge of bankruptcy. And they invested $13 million in ARM originally, and they sold it for $1.1 billion. Apple throws billions around now, but back in the late 90s, $1.1 billion was a whopping sum of money to Apple. And we often focus on the loan that Apple got from Microsoft in the late 90s to keep it ticking over. But it's interesting that this investment in ARM paid off to such an extent and really gave them the working capital that they needed to see them around the corner and give Steve Jobs the runway that he needed to go on through the dark days and deliver us the iMac, OS X, iPod, iTunes, and everything we know about Apple today. So it's interesting in that sense that the underlying technology of the Newton is not only the technology on which every Mac, every iPad, every iPhone is based today, but the capital that Apple earned from investing in that saved the company that it could go on to do those things. So as we think about the legacy of the Newton, let's not forget the ARM processors that made everything possible today, both in terms of technology and in terms of money.
There's a famous story that Acorn was developing the early version of the ARM processor that when they first plugged it into a board, the processor started running before the computer had even turned on, just because the background electrical charge running through the capacitors on the circuit board that they plugged it into were enough to power the chip. And that's exactly the kind of power efficient computing that they needed to make this device possible. Like in the 90s, this is the same era where you would plug 8 AA batteries into your Sega Game Gear and it would last for like 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. This is the same era where the Macintosh Portable weighed 20 pounds and it would get like a couple hours of battery life. The ARM chip made the Newton. The PowerPC chips at the same time ran incredibly hot. A PowerPC powered Newton would be the size of a book, but the Newton just ran off of 4 AA batteries and it would get really good battery life. Like you can even turn on the backlight and use it a good 8 hours or so, equivalent to like a modern iPad.
Another aspect of the legacy of the Newton is Johnny Ive and the eMate. And some of the stories that I've read, the design of the eMate, which was maybe one of the last Newton devices to be created prior to its destruction. Does anyone remember the eMate?
Yeah, by the second generation Newton products, they started to have such a solid enough foundation that they started to explore into other form factors. But it happened so late that they only got one out the door before the Newton was shut down. So the eMate 300 is like a very interesting footnote to its story. It is trying to turn the Newton into something closer to like a laptop. This was intended to be an educational laptop version of the Newton. So it's laptop shaped. It has translucent green plastic. So it's very much like the Bizarro World version of that iBook G3. It takes the swooping curves and lines to the extreme. It looks even more like a clam that you would find at the bottom of the ocean than the iBook does. Yeah,
this was the defining product of the clamshell portable era. And the first product that Apple made that was really making use of this transparent polycarbonate that would become such an important part of Apple's design language in the early years of Steve Jobs' return. Yeah, it's interesting in the 90s, there were 2 sectors where Apple performed quite well. I mean, I don't think by the late 90s it wasn't performing very well anywhere, but there were 2 sectors where it was performing quite well. One was the design and publishing industry, and the other was education. The eMate was a good idea, but as you say, Griffin, it was a bit late in the day by this point to salvage the Newton business. But schools were looking for cheaper portables that everyone could have on their desks. And you could definitely draw a line from eMate to the Chromebooks that are popular in schools today. Is that kind of idea of a much more stripped down technology, but it didn't look stripped down. It looked beautiful and had this, at the time, unique design language to it, which caught Steve Jobs' eye. And my understanding from the various books that I've read was that was part of what really put Johnny Ive in Steve Jobs' line of sight. One of the few senior executives from the previous era that Steve Jobs saw something in was Johnny Ive. And a big part of that was the eMate. And Steve Jobs could see the potential there. He could see the original thinking. And I think it excited him. And the conversations that he and Johnny Ive had were the start of a beautiful relationship that then led to so many of the iconic products that have followed. But you can see that design language. It translated into the clamshell PowerBook G3. Translucent polycarbonate was in the iMac, in the iBook. And that design language carried on for years and was copied by so many other companies. There was a time when almost every USB accessory you could buy had a semi-transparent enclosure, because even though Apple at that point wasn't the Apple of today, it became very influential in terms of its design language. And so people wanted a piece of that. And so it's interesting that eMate, the last and not very successful Newton product, but it had just a massive legacy on the company.
And I think what made the eMate Sync and the iBook soar, even though they only existed like a couple of years apart from each other, is touching back on what we said at the beginning, in that the Newton never had like a networking stack capable of really going on the internet. It didn't have Airport. The iBook was designed around Airport. It didn't have a web browser. Now, years later, after the fact, people have like hacked together ways to get their Newtons online. You know, you would have to add a gigantic thing sticking out of the PCMCIA slot, and eventually people have like written homebrew web browsers for it, but really it just missed that wave.
Just looking at it, well, first thing is it's got proper cursor keys, which is nice on the keyboard. But also, maybe this is Apple's only ever touchscreen laptop.
I should have known you'd go there. This is your dream product.
I really want one. Not one of these. Well, I would like one of these. No, I'm a touchscreen Mac. That was all. Please continue.
So rounding this up now, what have we learned? What does the Newton tell us about Apple's DNA, and what institutional learnings did Apple get from the Newton?
I think obviously a touchscreen Mac is going to be coming along. It seems to be the clear answer.
In your dreams. Anything else?
I think sometimes it's that you have this first draft idea of a product. I think there's a parallel you could make, like what the Newton is to the iPhone, I think the Lisa is to the Macintosh, and I think the Vision Pro is to whatever comes after the Vision Pro. When we were having this conversation about like the Newton versus the PalmPilot, I get echoes of like the Vision Pro versus the Meta Quest. The Vision Pro, it holds steadfastly to Apple's like unyielding philosophy that it needs to be AR, it needs to have full hand tracking, it needs to have eye tracking and all that. Whereas the Meta Quest is like, no, we'll just do controllers and we'll have a lighter thing that costs a fifth of the price. And maybe we'll figure out what the iPhone is to the Newton, as in like what the future product is to the Vision Pro. But, you know, the Vision Pro is also obscenely expensive.
That is interesting because I can see that parallel that you're making there. One of the learnings that I thought Apple had taken from the Newton, and maybe it's lost that learning now, is I think that Apple got burned with the Newton. It was first to market really with something, and there are so many firsts to the Newton, and it is a remarkable product in that respect, both in hardware and software and how tightly they integrated they are. There's so much that is quintessentially Apple about it. But the thing to me that is not so much Apple in the second Steve Jobs era is, I think, they got the timing of it wrong. They brought it out when it was technically possible, but maybe the technology wasn't quite there to deliver the vision. It was kind of a product that was ahead of its time. And to me, one of the things that Apple switched to was becoming more of a fast follower. Apple under Steve Jobs didn't race to be the first to market with a product, but they waited until they had the right product. So in that sense, to me, the Palm is maybe more of a Steve Jobsy kind of move than the Newton. The Newton was impressive, but as a product, I think it was a dud. There are some geniuses among us who figure out how to use it for stuff like Dungeons and Dragons. Mm-hmm. But for most people, it was a fascinating curiosity, but I think regular people didn't find a use for it. It wasn't so much a product as it was a proof of concept. And I think that Steve Jobs used to stress that he was a product guy, and to him, being a product guy and what that was about was not kind of pushing a technology, but starting with a use case or some kind of vision, you know, the classic one being 1,000 songs in your pocket, of some idea which captures the imagination and has a purpose to the user, and then building a product that delivers that. And the best I could come up with for Newton would be that it's kind of like a Filofax, but much more expensive and not as good. And I don't think that would have flown in the Steve Jobs era. I think the institutional learning for the Newton was don't race to be first, wait and time your entry to market when you have a product that delivers on a compelling solution for the end user. And post Steve Jobs, Apple still had that with stuff like Apple Watch. Apple Watch was not the first smartwatch. Samsung had a smartwatch and Google even had a smartwatch. And lots of commentators at the time were saying, oh, Apple's slow to market with this. Actually, when they did bring out the Apple Watch, they couldn't have brought it out any sooner, because even when they brought it out, it wasn't quite right. The technology was kind of slow. They brought it out as soon as they had something that they considered a product. And to me, that timing of coming to market at exactly the right time when the technology met the use case is, to me, a learning they got from the Newton. And I feel like with Vision Pro, maybe Vision Pro is more like a Newton again.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. It's really a step back. It's not the first headset by far, but it's also not the best. I mean, it's the best technically. I mean, it's incredible. The screens in there are great, and technologically, it's fantastic. But like you say, there's no clear use for it. I mean, you've got one, and I'm sure one day you can put your Dungeons and Dragons character sheet on it. But for anybody else, no one's going to buy one. And maybe that means that the PalmPilot's going to come along.
I don't think the Newton is a failure in the way that everybody describes it as being, because it isn't a bad product. It's a very good product. In the same way that the Vision Pro is a good product. But I think but it was a public experiment, and they figured out what made it work. And by the end of it, they figured out, oh, we were missing the big obvious thing in the room all along that we didn't know we were missing because, it hadn't been invented yet, wireless technology.
I thought you were going to say bow ties.
That's what the Vision Pro needs, no? A bow tie.
So rounding this up, Griffin, if people want to hear more from you, then I guess they can go to the Cultcast and they can read Cult of Mac. How can people connect with you online?
The only social media I'm really on is Mastodon, where you can find me at dgriffinjones@tech.lgbt.
Awesome. And Charlie, what about you?
The same, only on Mastodon. And I am Mr. Charlie at indieweb.social.
And you can find me, I'm at Graham Bauer. You find me on Instagram, Mastodon, and Threads. Well, Griffin, it has been so much fun. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. It's been such a pleasure to have you here.
Absolutely. I had a lot of fun with this.
Thanks so much. It's been special.